Pick that up, sweetheart. That's what Dr. Sterling said 3 weeks before the Pentagon showed up. He hurled a patient chart at Katie Rodriguez's feet during the lunch rush, watched it scatter across the tile floor in front of 17 nurses, residents, and med students, and smiled when her jaw tightened exactly 1 millimeter. She didn't know that Sterling had already made calls to 3 board members about her. She didn't know he'd spent the last 2 weeks documenting her movements, timing her breaks, building a file. What Sterling didn't know was that the woman standing in front of him had dragged 4 wounded Army Rangers through sniper fire in Fallujah while administering blood transfusions with one hand. The meek night nurse with the careful charting and the quiet voice had already survived worse than a scattered clipboard. But he would find that out the hard way. Mercy General's ER hummed under the fluorescent lights like a machine running at perfect efficiency, sterile and cold and relentless. Katie Rodriguez arrived for her 3rd week on night shift at 10:48 p.m. on a Tuesday, pushing through the automatic doors with her messenger bag slung across her chest and her scrubs already tucked in at the waist, the mark of someone who knew you didn't waste motion on loose fabric in a trauma bay. The antiseptic smell hit her like muscle memory, the same chemical edge she'd smelled in forward surgical teams from Ramadi to Kandahar, and she breathed through her mouth to keep from gagging. Her badge read K. Rodriguez, RN, in plain letters. That was all anyone needed to know. The trauma bay was organized with the precision of someone who'd worked in places where supplies don't get restocked. For kits arranged by gauge size. Angiocath needles in ascending order. The 7.5 endotracheal tube separated from the 7.0s because size mattered when a patient's airway was collapsing. Katie moved through her setup like a liturgy, each item a prayer, each placement a decision she'd made 1,000 times before. Her hands bore faint scars across the knuckles that she covered with long sleeves, thin white lines that told their own story to anyone who knew how to read them. She didn't. She just worked. At 11:15 p.m., Dr. Marcus Sterling pushed through the ER double doors with the kind of entrance that made people move. He was 53, grey at the temples in a way that read as distinguished rather than aging, with a build of someone who still played squash twice a week and never let anyone forget it. His loafers cost more than Katie's monthly rent. More importantly, his title as ER director meant he controlled the scheduling, the budgets, and, for the past 18 months, the billing codes that generated phantom charges for equipment that had never been ordered and patients who'd never existed. $68,000 in inflated contracts. $84,000 more through surgical supply kickbacks. $140,000 in Medicare fraud spread across coded patient encounters that his computer system had conveniently documented in real time. He watched Katie from his office window as she moved through the ER with her slight limp, the one from shrapnel that had missed her femoral artery by 3 centimeters and left her with chronic pain that she treated with ice packs in the break room instead of narcotics. Sterling saw vulnerability. He saw someone who wouldn't fight back. He saw a woman who'd be gone by October. What he didn't see was the way her hands never trembled during codes. What he didn't see was the way she could start and fall in a collapsed vein in 3 seconds flat, the way she positioned her body instinctively with her back to corners, the way she moved through the ER like someone who'd learned to survive in places where mistakes got people killed. He didn't see the legend of the Navy medic who'd pulled for Rangers through sniper fire while performing blood transfusions with one hand. He didn't see the combat boots tucked in her locker behind the scrubs, still caked with Ramadi dust the color of dried blood. At midnight, the first ambulance arrived with a 47-year-old woman presenting with acute appendicitis. Sterling watched Katie assist the attending, noticed the way she'd already drawn up the pre-op labs before being asked, noticed the way she moved the patient with hands that knew how to minimize pain without being told. He made a mental note, meticulous charting. Probably obsessive about documentation. That would be her weakness. Thorough people noticed things. Meticulous people found discrepancies. Discrepancies meant questions. Katie documented the patient intake in the electronic medical record with the same precision she'd used to maintain sitrep logs in combat zones. Time of arrival. Chief complaint. Vital signs with exact numbers. Medications administered with timestamps and route. Every single line coded perfectly, everything cross-referenced, nothing ambiguous. The kind of charting that made attorneys weep with joy during depositions. The kind of record that would eventually make Sterling weep too, but not for the same reasons. At 1:33 a.m., the trauma alert came through. Katie was stocking the crash cart when the radio crackled. "Mercy General Trauma Bay, be advised, we have a 28-year-old male, GSW ×3, abdomen and right upper quadrant, on scene vitals BP 84 systolic, HR 120, respiratory distress, ETA for minutes." She didn't move until the announcement finished. That was important. Not jumping. Not reacting. Just processing the information like data, like pain was information, like information meant you had control. For minutes. That meant setup time, 2 bags of O-negative hung and running. The massive transfusion protocol would wait until they had type and cross, but they'd be ready. Angiocath needle staged. The 5.0 endotracheal tube pulled and tested. Suction working. The defibrillator pads placed on the cart where Sterling would never look. The ambulance doors burst open at 1:37 a.m., and Captain Ben Lawson came through like a man who'd survived worse and nearly died from it. 3 gunshot wounds. Right upper quadrant entry near the liver. Abdomen entry with potential bowel perforation. Left groin entry with what might have been a femoral artery graze or might have been catastrophic bleeding held at bay only by the paramedics' direct pressure and Katie's steady voice cutting through the chaos like a laser. "Let's move, people." Trauma Bay 1. Someone get interventional on the phone. But that wasn't the worst part. That came later. In the moment, Katie moved toward Captain Lawson with the fluidity of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, and the attending combat medic who'd been assigned to his case, a Major Charles Halloway, 31 years old, tattoo of a faded unit insignia on his left wrist, looked up from the patient's chest and straight into Katie's hands as she steadied the fall line. And his eyes went wide. Not because of what he saw. Because of how he saw it. Katie's hands moved with the precise 3-layer closure technique used by Navy forward surgical teams, the kind of technique that saved lives in places like Fallujah and Kandahar and everywhere else that American military trained medics to expect the worst and still make it work. Halloway's face went very still. He recognized the signature. The economy of movement. The way she knew exactly where the pressure point was without being shown. He didn't say anything. But he didn't stop watching her either. Dr. Sterling arrived at 1:41 a.m., 13 minutes into the resuscitation, his loafers clicking against the tile in a rhythm that tried to sound authoritative and mostly sounded like a man who didn't belong in a trauma bay. He assessed the situation, patient intubated, 2 large bore 4s running, massive transfusion protocol initiated, labs pending, and his eyes landed on Katie like she was a math problem he couldn't solve. She was in the corner, exactly where she should be, charting the patient's arrival vitals with the same obsessive precision that Sterling had been watching for 3 weeks. O2 sat at arrival, 79. Heart rate, 138. Blood pressure, 84 systolic, 52 diastolic. Respirations, 32 and laboured. Every number exact. Every digit recorded. "You," Sterling said, pointing at her with his pen. "Step back. Let the real doctors work." Katie stepped back without comment, which was the problem and the solution all at once. She should have defended her charting. She should have pushed back. She should have done something that gave him an opening to be angry at her for the right reasons instead of the wrong ones. Instead, she just moved away from the patient and continued her documentation, and Sterling's anger at being ignored by someone beneath him became crystallized into something sharper and colder. At 2:08 a.m., Katie took her break in the break room and opened her locker. The combat boots were there, sitting on top of her extra scrubs like a prayer or a curse depending on the day. She touched the leather, rough and salt-stained from the Euphrates River, dust still ground into the seams from when she'd been carrying a wounded ranger across open ground, and 3 shots had missed her head by distances she'd measured in millimeters during the following weeks of therapy that hadn't helped. She didn't cry. She'd stopped crying years ago, sometime between Ramadi and the decision to leave the Navy without telling even her sister where she was going. She just closed the locker and went back to work. Sterling was waiting in the hallway when she returned. He didn't move toward her. He didn't raise his voice. He did something far more calculated. He stopped her with the casual entitlement of a man who'd never been told no by someone in scrubs. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, and the use of her last name was itself a small cruelty, a reminder that she wasn't part of his world. "I've made a little wager with the nursing staff. $20 says you don't make it to October. You'll quit. Burn out. Go find some easier hospital where the hours are shorter and the acuity is lower. What do you think? That sound about right?" Katie looked at him. Her jaw was steady. Her hands were steady. Her voice came out like still water. "I don't bet, doctor," she said, and that was all. No defense. No justification. Just a statement of fact, and then she was moving past him toward Trauma Bay 1, where Captain Lawson needed her charting and Major Holloway needed someone who understood that sometimes the smallest movements saved the most lives. Sterling stood alone in the hallway, listening to the sounds of the ER continue its rhythmic dance around him, the ventilator wheeze from Bay 1, the urgent beeping of the cardiac monitors, the rubber gloves snapping like gunshots as nurses pulled supplies, and something in his expression shifted from confident to calculating. He'd underestimated her. He was certain of that now. The question was what he was going to do about it. The coffee maker hissed as Katie filled her mug, back turned to the staff lounge where Dr. Sterling stood holding a $20 bill between two fingers like it was already burning him. 20 people. Morning shift change. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song above his head. "I'm taking bets," Sterling announced, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who'd already decided he was funny. "The mouse here won't last the week. She's too soft for emergency medicine. Who wants in?" Katie poured. One measured breath. The coffee smelled like burnt almonds, the hospital's economy blend, the kind that coated your mouth for hours. She continued pouring even though her cup was full, watching the dark liquid rise toward the rim with the precision of someone calculating angles. 3 nurses laughed nervously. The sound had teeth in it, the kind of laughter that happened when someone wanted to stay on the right side of power. Sterling pocketed the money he'd collected, grinning. His teeth were too white. Veneers, Katie thought. The kind of expensive fix that only worked if you smiled without thinking. She walked past him toward the door, eyes forward. He didn't move. She had to turn her shoulders to pass, her badge clipping against the doorframe with a soft metallic ping. "Better luck next week, mouse," he called after her. 2 days later, Katie carried her lunch tray through the packed cafeteria at 1,245 hours. Chicken noodle soup in a plastic bowl, a salad that had already begun to wilt, a chocolate pudding cup that she'd never eat. The lunch rush had transformed the cafeteria into something resembling controlled chaos, 40 people talking, the clatter of trays, the peculiar smell of institutional food heated to exactly the wrong temperature. Steam rose from the soup in small, nervous clouds. Sterling approached from her blind side, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to think about where he was going. His elbow connected with her tray at precisely the wrong angle, not violent enough to claim accident, not gentle enough to be anything else. The physics of it were deliberate. Katie's hands moved to catch the tray, but his momentum had already compromised the angle. The soup bowl lifted, rotated, and crashed to the tile floor with a sound like broken promises. Chicken noodles scattered across her white scrubs in a constellation of orange-brown stains. The soup soaked through the fabric instantly, warm against her skin, and the liquid spread across her shoes, the white nursing clogs that she'd polished that morning, already ruined. The room went dead silent. Sterling didn't apologize. He stepped over the mess like it was debris after an explosion, leaving her kneeling there in front of 37 witnesses. Katie knelt slowly, one knee, then the other, gathering the plastic bowl from the floor. Someone else stopped eating. Then another person. The silence had weight. "Careful there, mouse," Sterling said, not turning around. "You need steadier hands in this business." Katie picked up the pieces. Each noodle. Each drop of broth. One tear escaped down her right cheek, unbidden, the kind of tear that comes from a body betraying a mind's determination not to break. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She gathered the last of the bowl, stood, and still holding the mess, brushed her cheek with the back of her hand in one smooth motion without breaking eye contact with anyone. Her voice, when she spoke, sounded like still water, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I've cleaned up after IEDs, doctor. Chicken noodle soup doesn't rattle me." She walked toward the trash receptacle with the bowl still in her hands, her scrubs dripping, her composure like armor forged in a place most people couldn't find on a map. The cafeteria stayed quiet. Even the industrial refrigerators seemed to pause their humming. She changed into her backup scrubs, the one she kept in her locker for exactly these moments. The stained ones went into a plastic bag. She'd deal with them at home, hand-washing them in her apartment sink while watching the window for nothing in particular. She'd been washing things by hand for 12 years. Some habits didn't break, even when you wanted them to. The next shift, Sterling was waiting. Katie was charting in the nursing station at 2,340 hours when he appeared, holding a patient chart like it was evidence. 4 staff members were present. 3 of them found suddenly urgent reasons to be somewhere else. 1 stayed, pretending to review medication schedules while actually documenting everything. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, dropping the chart at her feet. Papers scattered across the floor, the kind of scatter that came from deliberate force, from someone who'd made sure every single page separated. "And next time, maybe chart accurately instead of wasting everyone's time with your little essays." The smirk was there. It always was. The kind of smile that a man wore when he'd already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Katie set down her pen. She moved from her chair with the same deliberate slowness she'd used in the cafeteria, no jerking, no angry movement, nothing that would give him the satisfaction of visible anger. She bent down slowly, one knee, then the other, and began collecting pages. Each one she placed in order, not the order they'd fallen, but the correct order, the way the chart was supposed to be organized. Page 1. Page 2. Page 3. Vital signs. Assessment. Plan. 1 measured breath between each page. "I've picked up pieces of people, doctor," she said, standing finally with the reassembled chart in her hands. "A clipboard doesn't scare me." Sterling's jaw tightened. She could see it happen, the muscle fiber contracting at the hinge, the slight whitening at the corner of his mouth. His eyes narrowed to something sharp, something focused, and in that moment Katie understood that she'd stopped being a problem he was toying with. She'd become a problem he needed to solve. He turned and walked away without speaking. That evening, while Katie was performing the final rounds of her shift, Sterling was in his office making phone calls. The first was to board member Thomas Hartwell, one of 3 people who controlled staffing decisions at Mercy General. Sterling's voice on the phone carried the particular tone of a man sharing urgent concerns about patient safety. "The new night nurse, Rodriguez. Excellent charting, yes, but I'm noticing patterns. She's been making unsanctioned procedural calls. Nothing documented, nothing approved. Just taking initiative in ways that, well, it concerns me. I'm wondering if we should have the administrator take a closer look." The second call was to Rebecca Chen, the hospital administrator, and Sterling's version of the story had evolved slightly. Now it was about liability. A nurse performing procedures outside her scope. What if there was an incident? What if something went wrong? The hospital's insurance rates could skyrocket. He was thinking about her professionally, about the institution's exposure. The third call went to the Colorado Nursing Board, not officially, just a colleague reaching out with questions. Katie Rodriguez had been charting at a level that seemed beyond typical RN scope. Were there credentials he should know about? Advanced certifications? Military background that might suggest she'd trained beyond civilian standards? Just asking for clarity. Purely professional. By the time Katie clocked out at 0630 hours, 3 separate investigations had been set in motion. She didn't know that yet. She would, soon enough. But for now, she walked out into the Denver dawn where the air smelled like rain coming and the sky was the color of old steel, and she had no idea that the fragile piece she'd built, this quiet job at this quiet hospital, the kind of invisible healing that had kept her breathing when breathing felt impossible, had already been marked for destruction. She had no idea what was about to arrive. The sirens arrived at 0200 hours, and Captain Ben Lawson came through the trauma bay doors on a stretcher that looked too small to hold all his blood. 3 bullet wounds from Ramadi. Entry wounds the size of coins. Exit wounds the size of fists. His lung was collapsing on the left side, the kind of slow suffocation that looks like sleep until your oxygen drops below 60 and your brain starts dying. Katie was finishing her charting at the nursing station when the alert came through. Trauma activation, incoming Ranger, GSW ×3, ETA 5 minutes. She looked up from her screen. Didn't move. Just listened to the way the ER coordinator said the words, urgent, practiced, the cadence of controlled emergency. The attending trauma surgeon, Dr. Reeves, was already scrubbing in. The combat medic, a man with corporal stripes and eyes the color of a winter beach, was setting up his suture kit with the precision of someone who'd done this in a Humvee with shrapnel still falling. The stretcher wheeled through the sliding doors like a boat cutting through dark water. Captain Lawson was pale as wax, his combat uniform cut away in long vertical strips, gauze soaked through with arterial red. His blood pressure was 78/42 and dropping. The kind of pressure that meant minutes, not hours. The ventilator team was already moving toward his face when Katie pushed through the curtain because that's what you did in a level 1 trauma. You showed up, you moved, you became part of the machinery that kept people breathing. Dr. Reeves was calling out orders. Let's get 2 large bore 4s, type O negative, start the level 1 infuser. His hands were steady but his voice had that edge that meant he was calculating probabilities and none of them looked good. The combat medic, his name tape said Holloway, was working on the deepest wound, the one that had gone through the captain's ribs and collapsed his left lung. His suturing was precise, methodical. 3-layer closure. The exact technique they taught at the Naval Trauma Training Center at Camp Pendleton. The kind of closure that held even when you had nothing but a field pack and incoming fire. Holloway's hands froze for a half second. That was all. Just a moment where the needle hung suspended and his eyes flicked up from the wound to Katie's hands as she reached for the decompression kit. He knew. Something in the way she moved told him. The way her fingers found exactly what she needed without looking. The way she positioned herself for the procedure, not tentative, not learning, but the stance of someone who'd done this 100 times in places where the sand blew sideways and the sound never stopped. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez had run forward surgical teams for 12 years. This wasn't her first needle decompression. This was muscle memory written into her cells. The captain's oxygen saturation was 58% and falling. The monitors were screaming. A sound like electronic panic, beeping in overlapping patterns that meant the body was losing its bargaining power. Katie's voice cut through the noise, not loud, but the kind of quiet that makes everyone hear you. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Nobody questioned her. That was the thing about real authority, it didn't need permission. Dr. Reeves stepped back half an inch. Just enough. Holloway watched as Katie's hands found the exact spot between the captain's ribs, that anatomical landmark that meant the difference between a breath and a code. She prepped the skin with a single decisive motion. No trembling. No hesitation. Her hands moved like they knew exactly where they were going because they did. They'd been there before. They'd been there in Ramadi when IEDs turned medical tents into sorting centers for the living and the dying. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. The sound that meant the lung could inflate again. The compressed air whistling out of the needle like a whistle from a ghost. Captain Lawson's oxygen saturation climbed. 60, 65. 72, the monitors began singing a different song, still urgent, but no longer the wail of a body in complete failure. 78, 82. The ventilator took over, pushing oxygen down into lungs that could actually expand now. Dr. Sterling arrived exactly 30 seconds too late. He came through the trauma bay curtain with the expression of a man who'd just realized his perfect plan had a flaw. His eyes tracked from the captain to the monitors to Katie's hands, which were already moving to secure the needle with tape and dressing. His jaw tightened. His pupils dilated in that particular way that meant anger or calculation or the kind of rage that gets stored in a notebook for later use. Katie didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge his presence at all. Just continued her work with the focused intensity of someone who understood that Captain Lawson's life was not yet secure. The deflation was temporary. The bigger wound still needed closing. The blood loss was still in the catastrophic range. But the immediate crisis, the suffocation, the death that was coming in seconds, that was bought off for now. She'd given them time. Holloway was still watching her. His eyes had gone very still, the way soldiers' eyes go when they're processing information that rewrites history. His corporal's brain was running the calculation, Navy forward surgical team closure technique, check. Emergency decompression with zero hesitation, check. The kind of calm under pressure that comes from surviving Fallujah and Ramadi and places in between. Check. He said nothing. Just returned to his sutures with the focus of a man who'd just sat across from a ghost and lived to tell about it. Dr. Sterling moved to the monitor bank. Watched Katie update the flow sheet with precise notation, time of decompression, needle gauge, air released, vital sign response. Everything documented exactly the way the literature demanded. He was calculating now. She performed an invasive procedure without his direct supervision. That was protocol violation. That was an opening. That was the kind of move that could be packaged and sent to the right people with exactly the right framing. The trauma team worked for another 40 minutes. The captain's wounds were stabilized enough for transport to the ICU. His pressure stabilized to 92/56, not good, but survivable. The kind of numbers that meant he'd live to be transported, and after that, the odds shifted slightly in his favor with every hour that passed. When it was done, when Captain Lawson was on the ventilator and heading upstairs with 2 nurses and a constant infusion running, Holloway stepped back. Pulled off his surgical gloves. His eyes found Katie one more time. "What's your name?" His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that carries weight. Katie didn't stop moving. Kept her hands busy cleaning the trauma bay, disposing of the wrappers and gauze and the packaging of a dozen medical supplies. "Rodriguez," she said. No first name. No elaboration. "How long?" His voice had changed. Lower. The tone that soldiers use when they're asking something that matters. She didn't answer. Just continued her work. And that silence, that complete refusal to volunteer information, told Holloway everything he needed to know. The quiet ones. The ones who kept their heads down and their mouths shut. Those were always the ones who'd seen everything. The ones who'd worn a uniform in the places where every day felt like the last one. He nodded once. Didn't push. Just walked out with the knowledge sitting in his chest like a stone. But that wasn't the worst part. That knowledge was actually a problem. Because 3 minutes after Holloway left the trauma bay, Dr. Sterling was already on the phone. His voice was smooth, professional, the voice of a man in control of institutional power. Board member Thompson picked up on the second ring at 02 for 7 hours, and Sterling was already constructing the narrative. Unsanctioned procedures. Cowboy medicine. Liability exposure. The word accreditation was mentioned 3 times. By 0330, the hospital administrator had been called. By 0400, an email had been sent to the Colorado Nursing Board. By 0500, Katie's file had been flagged for investigation. She was still in the ICU at 0600, sitting with Captain Lawson while his daughter slept in the waiting room chair, her hair falling across her face in that way that meant she'd been anxious. Katie was checking the drip rate on his pain medication when the captain's eyes opened, just for a moment, just enough to focus. He didn't speak. Just looked at her. And in that look was the recognition of someone who'd seen combat and understood what he'd just witnessed. She met his eyes, held them for one measured breath. Then she adjusted his pillow and said nothing at all. The machinery of Dr. Sterling's destruction had already been set in motion. In 6 hours, Katie would be escorted from the building. In 12, the investigation would be officially launched. In 18, she would sit at a bus stop in the rain with a cardboard box and the desperate weight of a secret that had finally been discovered by the one person at Mercy General who could recognize it. But for now, she checked the monitors, checked the 4 lines, made notes in the chart with a kind of precision that left no room for error, because precision was the only language she'd ever spoken, and it had kept her alive through 12 years of trying to disappear into the person she'd been before Ramadi made her into someone else entirely. Captain Lawson's oxygen saturation climbed steadily in the ICU bay as the monitors sang their soft mechanical hymn. 92%. 94. 96. The combat medic who'd frozen mid-suture stood beside Katie now, watching her chart notes with the kind of intensity reserved for people who'd seen miracles happen and forgotten to believe in them. His name was Mercer. 23 years old. Had a tattoo of a phoenix rising from Baghdad's skyline on his forearm, the kind of ink you got when you'd walked through fire and come out the other side. He watched her hands move across the paperwork, steady, precise, each note catalogued in chronological order without a single tremor. The needle decompression she'd performed had technically violated 4 hospital protocols. It had also kept Captain Lawson's left lung from collapsing into necrotic tissue. It had bought them the 11 minutes needed for the trauma surgeon to arrive. It had saved his life at 2:24 a.m. on a Thursday that neither of them would ever forget. "You trained forward surgical," Mercer said. Not a question. A statement of fact, the kind only another military medic could make. Katie didn't look up from the chart. Night shift. Charting takes concentration. The 3-layer closure technique you used. He stepped closer. Nobody does that except Navy combat medics. FST team specifically. I saw that closure in Fallujah. Saved my life. Literally. This guy took shrapnel through the abdomen and the medic used that exact pattern, and I walked away with 15% scarring instead of a colostomy bag. His voice had dropped to something quieter than respect. Something closer to recognition. You pulled him back from the edge using a technique that isn't even in most civilian trauma protocols. Katie signed the final page. The technique works. That's all that matters. She was wrong about that. What mattered was that Mercer had seen her hands move with the precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times in places where there was no margin for error. What mattered was that a combat medic's eyes had locked onto muscle memory, the kind that came from training in actual war zones, not simulation centers. What mattered was that by 3:15 a.m., Mercer had made a single phone call to JSOC from the hospital parking lot, standing in the Denver rain, speaking into a number that wasn't in any civilian phone directory. By 4:19 a.m., Dr. Sterling's phone began ringing. The first call came from Chairman Westbrook of the hospital board, who'd been asleep until 3:58 a.m. and was not happy about it. Sterling's voice changed when he answered, higher, more deferential, the voice he used when institutional power held the upper hand. "Yes, sir." "Of course, sir. I'll look into it immediately, sir." Whatever Westbrook said made Sterling's jaw clench. Whatever he heard made him pull up Katie's personnel file on his hospital computer, searching for inconsistencies. Searching for ammunition. Searching for the single thread that, once pulled, would unravel her entire fabricated civilian life. The second call came from Dr. Patricia Hayes, Chief of Medicine, asking pointed questions about unsanctioned procedures, liability exposure, and whether Sterling had documented the needle decompression properly. Sterling heard the ice in her voice and understood what it meant. The board was watching. The board was worried. The board was vulnerable to federal scrutiny if anything in the hospital's trauma response looked improper. That was all he needed. Liability. Exposure. The board's fear of federal investigation was the wedge he needed to drive between Katie and her employment. The procedure wasn't authorized, he told Dr. Hayes. The attending physician, that was me, was not consulted. She acted unilaterally. It was a lie. He'd arrived too late to stop her. He'd seen her work and done nothing. But the lie had structure. The lie had utility. The lie had teeth. The third call went out from Sterling himself at 4:11 a.m. to a contact at the Colorado Board of Nursing, a woman named Miranda Chen who'd gone to medical school with him, who owed him a favor from 10 years ago when he'd recommended her daughter for a prestigious internship. "Miranda," he said, his voice carrying concern like a funeral director carries flowers, "I need to report a serious incident. One of our nurses, Katie Rodriguez, performed an emergency procedure without attending physician authorization last night. I'm concerned about her credentials. I think you should pull her file and conduct a formal review." He waited while she asked questions. He answered carefully, each sentence structured to plant seeds of doubt without making overt accusations. "I just want to make sure she's properly qualified. For patient safety." Patient safety. The most dangerous words in healthcare, because they were also the most righteous. They justified investigations. They justified suspicion. They justified the slow institutional strangling of someone's career before any legal process could begin. By 6:41 a.m., Sterling had called the hospital's chief administrative officer, a woman named Susan Reeves who controlled 3/4 of the administrative budget and had absolute power over hiring and termination decisions. "Susan," Sterling said, his voice layered with concerned professionalism, "I have serious concerns about one of our night shift nurses. Pattern of insubordination. Possible credential issues. I think we need to initiate a formal investigation before we have a liability exposure." He gave her Katie's name. He gave her the incident report he'd already begun drafting, not the real one, the sanitized one, the one that positioned him as concerned and conscientious rather than someone actively investigating her in hopes of finding something that would stick. By 6:41 a.m., an HR investigator named Thomas Paulson had been assigned to the case. He was the kind of bureaucrat who understood that investigations were cover-your-ass operations, paperwork shields designed to protect institutions from liability. He wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in documentation. He was interested in a file thick enough that when lawyers eventually asked questions, the hospital could say they'd done their due diligence. By 8:44 a.m., Paulson had drafts of 3 fabricated incident reports prepared, incidents that had never happened, insubordination that had never occurred, procedural violations that existed nowhere except in Sterling's manufactured narrative. Katie came to work at 10:19 p.m. on Thursday night as she had every night for the previous 3 weeks, carrying the weight of another shift, another opportunity to help, another 12 hours of being invisible. She didn't know yet. She had no way of knowing. The network of calls had happened in the hours she'd slept, in the conference calls she wasn't invited to, in the institutional machinery that moved like a vast organism protecting itself from perceived threat. She made it to the supply room, where she kept her locker. The space was utilitarian and dim, metal shelves lined with surgical equipment, boxes of gloves arranged in ascending sizes, the faint smell of bleach and antiseptic that had become the scent of safety in her mind. She opened her locker. Inside, her spare scrubs, her ID badge, her phone on silent, and at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep the dust contained, the pair of worn combat boots from Ramadi. They were caked with 17 years of dirt. The leather was cracked in places from desert heat and impact. The sole of the right boot had been resoled twice because the original had been torn through by shrapnel on a patrol she still didn't talk about. She kept those boots because they were evidence, material proof that she had existed as someone other than the quiet nurse no one noticed. They were proof that she'd been useful. They were proof that she'd mattered. She never heard Thomas Paulson come in. He appeared with the kind of quiet that suggested he'd been trained for this, standing in the supply room doorway with a manila folder and an expression of administrative regret. Beside him stood Monica Torres, the hospital's chief of staff, who couldn't make eye contact. Behind them both was a security guard, not the friendly one who usually worked nights, but someone she didn't recognize. Someone whose presence meant this wasn't a conversation. This was an escort. Katie, Paulson said, and his voice had the texture of rehearsal. "We're going to need your badge." She looked at the badge hanging around her neck. The photo had been taken 3 weeks ago, on her first shift. She looked terrified in it. She looked small. That seemed appropriate now. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. Not even really addressed to anyone in the room. "There's an investigation," Monica said, finally looking at her. "Into your conduct. Your procedures. We've had reports of serious protocol violations." Katie didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She unclipped her badge and held it out. The plastic was already worn at the corners. Her fingers had worried the edge to transparency in just 21 days. "I need to know what I'm accused of." "You'll be contacted by HR," Paulson said. "Pending investigation. We're not discussing specifics at this time." The security guard stepped forward. He was built like a concrete wall, solid, impenetrable, not unkind but not interested in conversation. His presence was the punctuation mark on everything. Whatever had happened in those conference calls at 4 a.m. had moved past discussion and into action. Past suspicion and into termination procedure. She walked out past them, down the corridor where she'd spent 3 weeks learning the rhythm of night shift, where she'd gotten to know the overnight cleaning staff by name, where she'd stabilized a septic patient and saved a man's life with her hands. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song. Rain hammered the windows. Denver's monsoon season had come early this year, and the water fell like artillery, hard and relentless. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, which meant 3 blocks of Denver rain soaking through her thin jacket, 3 blocks of carrying the cardboard box that had somehow materialized with her belongings, her cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," bought from a gas station gift shop, a dying succulent with leaves the color of rust, and a photograph printed small on ordinary paper. 4 people stood in that photograph, all in Navy working uniform, all with their arms around each other in front of a decimated schoolhouse in Ramadi. 3 of the faces were circled in black marker. Kia. Killed in action. 18 years had passed and she still couldn't look at those circles without something cold moving through her chest. She sat at the bus stop bench and didn't cry. The rain soaked through to her skin. Her phone buzzed from inside the box, a text from Mercer, the combat medic. "You okay? Haven't seen you come back from break." She turned the phone off without reading the rest. The bus was running late. The schedule said 11:56 p.m. At 11:52, she was still waiting. Water ran down her face, mixing with a single tear that had escaped without permission. She didn't bother wiping it. She just sat and watched the streetlights blur through the rain and wondered if she would spend the rest of her life running from the woman she'd been in Ramadi, the woman who had carried people out. The woman who had mattered. The woman who had known exactly who she was. The rain fell like judgment across Denver, each drop striking the metal bench where Katie Rodriguez sat motionless, a cardboard box balanced on her lap like an offering nobody wanted. Her scrubs clung to her shoulders, soaked through to the skin underneath, but she didn't move to shelter. The bus stop had that particular quality of late-night emptiness, the fluorescent shelter casting a sickly glow that made the darkness beyond it absolute. Inside the box sat 3 things: a cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a succulent plant that was dying the way neglected things die, slowly, without drama, and a photograph. The photograph was the real weight in her hands. 4 faces, sunburned and grinning, standing in front of a schoolhouse in Ramadi with walls painted fresh white by hands that believed in permanence. 3 of those faces had stopped existing in 2009. One of them was hers, younger, unbroken, still believing the body could be a shield if you positioned it correctly. She stared at the photo and didn't cry. Her tear ducts had forgotten how, somewhere around year 7 of not crying. The water on her face was just rain. She told herself this with the same conviction she'd used to tell herself that leaving the Navy was survival and not cowardice, that working night shifts under fluorescent lights was healing and not hiding, that being invisible was a choice and not a sentence. The bus arrived at 11:36 p.m. She didn't board it. Instead, she sat and watched the taillights fade into the Denver night, and then she sat some more, breathing in air that tasted like wet concrete and the ghost of her own mortality. What Katie didn't know, what she sat at that bus stop with no way of knowing, was that a SEAL liaison officer named Commander Marcus Graves was walking into Mercy General's administrative conference room at that exact same moment, his boots making a sound like thunder on Italian marble, two Pentagon officials flanking him like armor. The combat medic, Mercer, had made the call at 10:03 p.m., exactly 17 minutes after Katie's ID badge had been confiscated and she'd been escorted through the staff exit like a thief. Mercer had told Graves everything: the needle decompression, the hands that moved with the muscle memory of a forward surgical team, the way she'd called out vitals like someone who'd done this in 130-degree heat with mortars walking toward her position. The next words out of Graves's mouth had changed everything. What was her name? Not who is she, but what was her name? The question of someone who already knew that the answer would matter, would ripple, would bring consequences that Dr. Sterling couldn't have anticipated in his most ambitious calculations. The hospital administrator, Thompson, sat across from Graves with the posture of a man who suddenly understood he'd been playing chess with someone who'd been playing 4D warfare. Dr. Sterling stood near the corner of the conference room, his lawyer arriving 12 minutes too late, his face already sliding into the expression of someone watching his life disintegrate in real time. Commander Graves opened a red folder. Inside was a decoration list. Not a resume. A list of medals, each one a sentence a life saved or a line held or a choice made when the right choice was the one that cost everything. 2 bronze stars, Graves said, and his voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all contained power, waiting. He didn't look at Sterling. Purple Heart, awarded twice. Navy Commendation Medal. He paused. Let the weight settle. For dragging 4 wounded Rangers through sniper fire to an extraction point while maintaining transfusion protocols with one hand. The silence in the room stretched like taffy. Sterling's lawyer had gone pale. Thompson's hands had started shaking. One of those Rangers, Graves continued, was Captain Benjamin Lawson. He's awake now. He's going to walk again. His daughter is in the waiting room downstairs asking when she can thank the woman who saved her father's life. Sterling opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The lion was gone. What remained was just a man in a $3,000 suit, understanding that he'd spent 3 days trying to destroy the most decorated female combat medic in the Denver VA region's intake system, and that he'd done it while she was working as a night nurse because she needed to be somewhere that nobody knew her name. And that's when the FBI agent stepped forward. His badge said Federal Bureau of Investigation, and his voice carried the particular cadence of someone reciting facts that would be entered into court documents. Dr. Richard Sterling, we've completed our preliminary investigation. Not an investigation. The preliminary investigation. The one that hadn't even gotten interesting yet. In the course of reviewing your attempt to falsify Katie Rodriguez's personnel records, an attempt that tripped a federal flag because falsifying documentation of someone with active DoD security clearance is a federal crime, we discovered 18 months of Medicare billing irregularities. Inflated equipment contracts totaling $847,000. Phantom procedures. Ghost consultations with physicians who claim no record of the visits. The agent's eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, and they never blinked. We also discovered communications with board members in which you indicated Ms. Rodriguez was a liability. Those communications, combined with the forged documentation, constitute wire fraud, healthcare fraud, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Sterling's hands had started to shake. Actual, visible trembling, the kind that would have made him dismiss a resident for showing in the OR. Your medical license is suspended pending review. You will not return to this facility. Dr. Richard Sterling was handcuffed at 6:14 a.m., exactly 42 hours after he'd thrown a patient chart at Katie's feet. He was handcuffed during morning rounds, led past the nursing station where nurses who'd laughed at his jokes were suddenly very interested in the charts in front of them. His tie was askew. His face was the color of undercooked meat. He tried to speak once, something about misunderstandings, about how things had gotten out of hand, about how nobody was supposed to, but an FBI agent had simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "I'd like to advise you to remain silent." Sterling remained silent. The lead nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at Mercy General for 19 years, watched him pass and felt something like vertigo. She'd heard the rumors in the break room, the confirmation that everything he'd done to Katie Rodriguez was documented, recorded, and now federal. Her hand steadied as she updated Captain Lawson's chart, respiratory function at 92%. Consciousness returning. Daughter permitted visitation. The daughter, Maya Lawson, was 12 years old, and she'd overheard one of the administrators on the phone saying the name Senior Chief Rodriguez. The child had grown up on military bases. She knew the cadence of rank, the weight of it. She'd asked an MP in the hallway, "Why is he calling her Senior Chief?" The MP had gone very still, and then he'd excused himself to make a phone call. But Katie didn't know any of this. She sat in a motel room off I-25, registered under a name that wasn't hers, eating saltine crackers from a vending machine, watching rain streak a window that faced the parking lot and the highway and the rest of America where nobody knew what she'd been. Her phone had been off for 8 hours. She turned it on at 1:34 a.m., and it exploded. 43 messages. 57 missed calls. Text from an unknown number, "This is Captain Lawson's daughter. Thank you for my father." Text from Mercer, "Call me immediately." Email from the hospital administrator, "Katie, there has been a significant development. Your suspension is lifted. Please contact HR." Voicemail from the SEAL liaison, "Senior Chief, we need to talk about the investigation. Call me." Code word is remedy. She sat and listened to the voicemails without breathing, without moving, as if staying perfectly still could prevent the words from reaching her. The last one was from Maya Lawson, recorded by her mother at Maya's insistence. "My dad says you're a senior chief and you saved his life and you're the bravest person he's ever met. I think you're really cool and I hope you're okay because my dad is okay and it's because of you." The girl's voice cracked slightly. There was the sound of an adult comforting her, and then the message ended. A knock came at the motel room door at 2:08 a.m. Katie didn't move. The knock came again, patient and deliberate. She opened the door to find Mercer standing in the Denver rain with an envelope in his hand and water streaming down his face, and he said only one word, "Listen." She listened to everything. The handcuffs, the badges, the medals being read aloud in a conference room like a benediction. The realization that Commander Graves had found her through his call, that the Pentagon had taken the time to understand who she was, that she hadn't been forgotten in the way she'd constructed her forgetting. Mercer's voice was steady as he told her, Sterling's network fell apart. Board members who promised him support suddenly claimed they never authorized anything. His lawyer couldn't get him released. The FBI has him on federal charges. Katie's face remained expressionless, the composure of someone whose spine had been replaced with titanium somewhere around year for deployment. But when Mercer slid the envelope under her door and she opened it, a letter from Maya Lawson in careful cursive thanking her, and a photograph of Captain Lawson awake and smiling, the tubes gone, his eyes focused, Katie Rodriguez sat on the edge of the motel bed and cried for the first time in 18 months. Not from sadness. From the terrifying, impossible possibility that she might be allowed to stop running, that the woman she'd buried could be exhumed and reclaimed, that her name and her hands and her knowledge might be permitted to live in daylight again. She held the photograph of a man she'd saved and understood that some things could be whole again, that some wounds could be survived, that sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one holding everything together. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez stood in a corner office at the Denver VA Medical Center with her name on the door and the word Senior Chief under it, and she was teaching combat medic techniques to nursing students who looked at her with the kind of reverence reserved for legends. The cracked mug from Mercy General sat on her desk next to a thriving succulent, finally receiving sunlight. The photograph of her Ramadi fire team hung in a proper frame, and sometimes students would ask about the faces, and Katie would tell them they stayed. "I lived. So I teach." Captain Lawson visited monthly, fully recovered, with his daughter in a junior ROTC uniform that made him stand straighter. Dr. Sterling sold supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall in Colorado Springs, his medical license permanently revoked, his hands shaking every time a customer asked if he used to be a doctor. He faced 3 years in federal prison starting in 90 days. He saw Katie once, walking past with 2 VA colleagues, laughing at something one of them said, and he turned away. She noticed him, paused for exactly 1 measured breath, and kept walking. He was no longer worth her silence or her words. That night, Katie sat with a 19-year-old Marine who'd lost both legs below the knee and was having night terrors, and she held his hand while he shook in the darkness. She told him what her first team leader had told her in Ramadi: you do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to show up when people are broken and refuse to leave. The Marine's breathing steadied. Katie stayed until dawn, her combat boots visible under her desk, clean now, but still kept close, no longer a talisman of shame but a reminder that hell could be survived and soft hands could carry weight beyond measure. She didn't flinch. She didn't break. She just showed up. And tomorrow, she would do it again. If you've made it this far, you understand something fundamental: the people who save lives aren't always the ones with the loudest voices. Subscribe to see more stories about the ones who show up in the silence. Like this video if you believe that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Comment below, would you have had the composure Katie showed when everything fell apart? And hit that notification bell because next week, we're telling the story of a therapist who recognized a serial killer's voice on a podcast and risked everything to stop him. You don't want to miss what she did next.